All right, we head into our first body system, which is the integumentary system. It is actually the largest system in your body. Your skin is your largest organ. Makes up about 16% of your body weight, and that includes all of the integument, appendages, and all. And you can see it's almost 2 meters square of surface area. So it takes up a lot of space. And there are two primary sections of the integument, the cutaneous membrane, which is our skin, and we'll talk about the various layers of that. So there is a superficial outer layer called the epidermis, and that is made of epithelial tissues and cells. And then you have the deeper portion of the skin, which is the dermis, that's made of connective tissues. And there's even a subcutaneous or hypodermis layer, which is primarily fat or adipose tissue. And we'll talk about that as well. There are numerous accessory or appendages to the skin, and most of those originate in the dermis, so the deeper layer. And they extend up and through the skin to the epidermis. Things like our hair and hair follicles, various types of exocrine glands like sebaceous glands and sudoriferous, aka oil and sweat glands, and then our nails. So you'll be doing a lot of labeling with the integument, looking at these different layers. So here you can see the epidermis being very, very thin and superficial in nature. And then you can see the very thick layer of the dermis here. Excuse me, a little too far. The dermis. So you have two divisions there, a papillary and reticular layer. And there's that subcutaneous layer that I mentioned, which has a lot of adipose cells in it. Note that you're going to have blood vessels and sensory receptors primarily in the dermis, all right, not in the epidermis. And then you're going to have lots of loose connective tissue, so that adipose tissue deep to the dermis. Here are a lot of the accessory structures that you will find. So things like our hair shaft and our hair follicle, and erector pili muscle. So when we talk about goosebumps, this is the muscle responsible for those goosebumps. You can see an oil gland, a sebaceous gland. Those are always going to be linked to hair follicles to moisturize and lubricate the hair follicle. You have nerve fibers running throughout the dermal layer, so we can have sensory reception. You have sweat glands located within the skin. It's going to release sweat, which we already know has to do with body temperature regulation. You have vascularization, so blood vessels. You've got those adipose cells here. What else are we looking at? You've got some corpuscles, both tactile, so for pressure and sensation, and lamellar, again, which will have to do with sensory reception. And then you can see the various pores for those sweat glands that are located as well. We've actually already talked about some of the functions of the integumentary system when we looked at our first unit and talked about body temperature regulation. The skin plays an important role in that, as you can see here. But it does a lot of other things, okay? It's involved in excretion and protection. It produces a lot of substances, particularly melanin, keratin, and vitamin D. It stores primarily fat, lipids, and then it has sensory reception and obviously plays a role in the immune system. So I actually kind of like this diagram better than just the list because it ties in the functions, which you can see here: protection, storage, immune response, sensory, synthesis, excretion, thermoreg, and it kind of associates them with where in the skin and the integument it's located. So just let's look at the epidermis for right now. You can see its protection. It prevents water loss because it has this thick layer of, or multi-layer, I should say, of dead cells that act as a buffer between the deeper layer, the dermis, and the external environment. Sensory reception, synthesis of vitamin D, all of those are functions that the epidermal layer does. Then you go down to the dermis and you can see more sensory reception, nourishment and vascularization through our veins and arteries, body temperature regulation through our blood vessels. And then you jump over to the accessory structures. You can see that excretion and temperature regulation through those exocrine glands, those sweat glands. You can see those sensations through our hair and protection through our nails. So I do like this. I would make note of this diagram. I think it does a nice job of associating functions with the integument. But what we're mainly going to talk about in this first lecture is the epidermis. So that superficial layer, it's primarily made of stratified squamous. Stratified means multi-layered. Squamous is the shape of the cell that makes up the epithelial tissue. It is avascular. Avascular means it has no blood vessels in it. So there are no blood vessels that run through the epidermis. Only the deepest layer of the epidermis is going to be nourished by blood vessels, and those vessels are in the dermal layer, which is deep to that. Those nutrients like oxygen and glucose and things like that are going to make their way through diffusion from that layer. Oops, sorry. And you can see just how thin that layer is when we kind of peel it away from the papillary layer of the dermis beneath. And then you can see it in the actual view. There's your corneum layer, there's your basement membrane, and here's your dermal layer. You can see a significant difference tissue-wise in the types of cells that make up the epidermis and the types of cells and tissue that make up the dermis. All right, in terms of cells that are located there, the main attraction are called keratinocytes. They are the most abundant epithelial cell in the epidermis, and they contain this substance called keratin. And it is tough, and it's going to be used to fill up these epithelial cells so that they essentially become waterproof and are able to protect the deeper layers of the body. And there are two primary types of skin. You have thin and thick. The majority of our skin is actually thin, meaning it has 4 layers of these keratinocytes. And even within those layers, there's going to be multiple layers. But you do have a few areas in your body that has thicker skin, your palms of your hands and soles of your feet. And that's an evolutionarily, it's linked to a time when we would have used our hands for climbing and things like that. And obviously the soles of our feet for walking or running. That's going to have 5 layers of those keratinocytes. So those are our 5 strata. I suggest coming up with a little acronym. I just go BSGLC, just with those first initials. You could go the other way. This is from the deepest or basement membrane to the free surface or the most superficial contacting the external environment layer. But I usually just use those first initials so I remember my sequence, and we're going to walk our way through. I like to walk our way through when we are looking at an actual diagram. I think it's helpful. And then I'll touch on a few of the other slides after this to go over some of the specifics. So the deepest layer, the layer that sits just above what's called the basement membrane, which is the membrane that connects the dermal layer through the dermal papilla, which are these little bumps here, to the actual epidermis, is called the stratum basal. Basal at the bottom. All right, so basal at the bottom, it's the deepest layer, and it attaches to this basement membrane. So it anchors to the dermal papilla and the papillary layer. It has what are called stem cells, which are known as basal cells. And what that means is that they are actively mitotic. So they are constantly undergoing mitosis. And they can do that because they are being nourished by the blood vessels that are located in the dermal layer. They have cells called melanocytes. Melanocytes are going to produce a pigment called melanin, which is one of the ways in which we get our skin color and protects us from ultraviolet radiation from the sun. And then it's going to also have cells called Merkel cells or tactile cells. And these cells are going to be nerve cells, receptors that are going to allow us to gather sensory reception data at that deep layer. All right, just superficial to that is a layer called the stratum spinosum. All right, so that's this section here. So basal is here, it's just this single layer right on the basement membrane. As you can see, the stratum spinosum is located above that, a little bit thicker. And that's primarily going to be a whole bunch of keratinocytes. So these cells that produce that protein called keratin, and they are going to be bound together by a type of cell junction called a desmosome, meaning that they just kind of link together in that space. The next layer, which is very small, and that's this tiny little purple layer here, that is the stratum granulosum. And basically in this layer is where we have the keratinocytes producing the keratin, so producing this high level of protein. And what happens is that keratin is going to essentially connect and fill these cells, and the cells are actually going to start to change shape. They are going to start to flatten out and lose some of their internal organelles. And that's going to allow for more keratin to fill them. And the cells actually are going to die. They're going to become dead cells. And that's in their progression on their way to our last layer. In those thick skin areas, though, in our soles of our feet and palms of our hand, we have a very thin, transparent layer of these keratinocytes, and those are called, that is called the stratum lucidum. All right, lucidum like see-through. All right, And then as you can see, this huge chunk of space, all right, this huge chunk of space, this is the stratum corneum. Cornea meaning horny, all right, or rough. And this is a multiple layers. So you're talking, 15 to 30 layers of dead, flattened, interconnected keratinocytes. And they are filled, and even though they are flat, they are filled with keratin. And keratin is a water resistant substance, but not completely waterproof, right? Think about if you sit in the pool too long or the bath, you get kind of pruny. And that's because your skin does absorb water, but it is water resistant. So it doesn't allow you to completely blow up like, Harry Potter's aunt, as she floats away. So that's not what happens here. It's going to provide that resistance, but not completely waterproof you. And that's a good thing because that allows us, some temperature regulation issues as well. You're going to want to know these layers. You're going to want to be able to label them and know what's happening in each. I'm going to slide through the next few slides. I'm not going to talk about everything on there because I just did an overview, but I'll just point out a few things that I didn't mention. So again, we're starting at that basal layer. Do note it's a single row and it's actively mitotic. That would be your key piece. It does have what are called epidermal ridges, and that basically sits on what are called dermopapilla. And the dermopapilla actually result in what we refer to as our fingerprints. So they create a pattern, and there's a few different types of patterns that the dermopapilla can form on our fingers. And so those fingerprints are a result of those tiny little bumps that are a result of the interaction between the epidermal ridges and the dermopapillae. Here are those tactile discs or those Merkel cells. And again, basically it's a sensory nerve ending. It responds to touch, so tactile meaning to touch. So it's a touch receptor. And we usually have these cells located on hairless skin, so places on our body that doesn't have hair, which is not too many. We're pretty hairy creatures. And then there's also those melanocytes, and I mentioned that they already contain that pigment called melanin. Here's that spiny layer or the stratum spinosum, and you can see here again, it's about 8 to 10 layers of keratinocytes, and they are connected kind of in that interconnected way. They are produced, by the stratum basal, so that actively mitotic layer beneath. Those cells are then pushed more superficial to the spinosum layer. Some may actually continue division for a short time, others might not. But there is an important cell located in the stratum spinosa, and those are called Langerhans cells or dendritic cells. And basically, these are white blood cells called macrophages. Think of like Pac-Man or Miss Pac-Man. And they basically move around within the skin and gobble up things that don't belong, bacteria, viruses, fungus, something that makes its way into the skin, especially if you have some type of wound. These cells are constantly making their way through, gobbling up some bad things and eating them up. You'll also learn that they are the cells responsible for keeping tattoos visible for long periods of time because they're also going to gobble up some of that pigment. And we'll learn about that this week as well. The next layer, that smaller layer, is called the granular layer or the granulosum, and it's 3 to 5 layers. So much smaller than the spinosum layer. And these cells come from that stratum spinosum. By the time the cells have progressed to this point, they've basically stopped dividing. All right, they basically stopped dividing. And so what you have here is keratin and keratohyalin, and this is going to result in those protein production and the death of those cells. So we have that cell death occurring at that time. All right, here's that lucidum layer, flat, dead keratinocytes, very thin, very transparent, only found palms of hand and soles of feet. And lastly is the stratum corneum. So let's talk just briefly about this. Keratinization is that protective layer formation of the protein-filled cells that are now these keratinocytes that have keratin in them. Usually takes a little over a week for the cells to progress through from basal to corneum layer. Usually these cells on the outside of your skin usually shed about within 2 weeks of making its way to that superficial layer. But overall throughout your body, roughly around 50,000 cells are shed per minute. So everything you look at on the outside of your body, from your hair to your nails to your skin, all of those cells are dead. And so that's, just a kind of interesting concept, in and of itself. Last but not least here, because we're talking about the epidermis, And we are very concerned about water retention. There are two ways in which we lose water from the skin. You have two types of perspiration that are involved. I'm going to jump down to the second one first, which is sensible perspiration. And what that means is that this is programmed, body temperature regulated sweat gland perspiration, where we are excreting water for a body temperature regulation function. And then you have insensible perspiration. And basically, you're going to have water that's going to diffuse through the stratum corneum and evaporate just on the regs. And that is usually somewhere around about half a liter, about 500 milliliters per day. And that's just regular evaporation, and diffusion of water loss. But if you do have some type of burn, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, that rate is going to significantly increase. And that is why dehydration is our biggest concern when we have a burn victim.